Did somebody say games? Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Hide and Q, which is episode 9 of season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the episode Hide and Q. So Hide and Q is the episode while the Enterprise is on a very urgent rescue mission. The Q interrupts them in order to play games, but we find out the purpose of these games is to tempt Riker with the power of the Q, and Riker is indeed tempted when Picard forces him to not use his power, and he could have saved a little girl's life had he used his power. So he has a meeting with all the senior officers where he offers them a gift, and one by one the senior officers reject this gift and saying that they would rather be the way that they actually are. And so they realize that that Riker doesn't really want the power of the Q, and humans shouldn't have the power of the Q, and Q is humiliated and dragged away by his fellow Q for failing to tempt Riker. So yeah, I don't know. I think this episode, so I talked about Q in Encounter at Farpoint, and I think this is a better version of Q. I think he is becoming more of the good character. But as I mentioned, I don't think that Q was a good character until season 3. I think in the first 2 seasons, he was too menacing. But you see, they lean a little bit more towards the comedic side in this episode. But not as much. I don't think he really worked as a character until they made him full-on comedic like they did in Deja Q and Cupid. But then you have episodes like Tapestry, True Q, and All Good Things where he was actually kind of serious, but they didn't really play him as a threat. I mean, All Good Things he kind of was, but he wasn't like the main threat. He was just sort of had this sort of helpful hand while messing with them at the same time, where we're not there yet. With Encounter at Farpoint, of course, he was judging all of humanity, and here he is trying to tempt Riker to become a Q in order to control humanity, because the Q are afraid of what humanity could become, which I think is kind of a dumb plot, to be to be fair. But yeah, and so he still has very cruel intentions, and he behaves more like an adversary in this episode. He puts Tasha Yar in the penalty box, he threatens to kill her, he releases this army of animal things that kill Wesley and Worf, and he has very foul intentions with Riker. And so he's definitely more menacing and not sort of the mischievous helping hand that he will become. And plus, even episodes like Tapestry, which are kind of serious, Q's funny in that episode. So they work him better as a comic relief type character. Now, I think this episode's better than Encounter at Farpoint. It's an improvement because you do see elements of that comedic side of him. For example, one of my favorite parts was when Picard was recounting the events of Encounter at Farpoint and saying, well, how dare you try to come up here and be our friend, because blah, 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 you did this and you seized our vessel, and again, you seized my vessel. And I like how Q was like, oh, and that angered you, did it not? Seize my vessel, seize my vessel. That was funny. I did like that. And then a few other moments where I thought he was kind of like when he appeared as like the priest at the end, and he is like, "I forgive your blasphemy." It's kind of amusing, but yeah, I don't know. He, as I said, he still came off as too menacing, he's not quite working in this episode. And the other thing about this episode is I remember hearing the concept of this episode, and I was like, wow, this sounds amazing. Q shows up and forces the bridge crew to play games, and he puts like Tasha Yar in the penalty box. I'm like, that sounds cool. But it's actually not really games. He's just like beams him down on the planet and unleashes he keeps referring to games, like when Riker said we don't have time for the games, and that's when he's like, couldn't somebody say games? And then he talks about games should have rules and should be a test of strength, and what should these, but it's not really a game. It's just that he releases an army of like these weird animal thingies in French Revolutionary uniforms with muskets that fire laser beams or phasers or whatever, that are like sort of unbeatable and too hard for the bridge crew to defeat. And then he just tells Riker to use his power of the Q to get them out of there. So it's not really like, and at one point they said, oh, the true purpose of these games is to tempt Riker, to test Riker. But it's not really. It's not a game. It's just a army of weird animal things coming in force to kill them. That's not a game. And also the whole thing with the penalty box lasted, I realized while I was watching this time around, it lasted like 2 minutes. Or no, it was a bit longer than 2 minutes. Maybe it was 5 minutes. But it was basically one scene. Q puts Tasha in the penalty box. Then we see her on the bridge. She's crying, oh, I'm in the penalty box. And Picard's like, tears are allowed for those in penalty boxes, or some bullshit. I didn't like that scene. I thought it was a bit cheesy. But anyway, yeah, so, and then Q shows up and Picard complains, oh, blah, blah, I don't know, he says some shit, and Q's like, okay, penalty over. It's like, she was in the box for one scene. It's not really a box either. It's the bridge. and yeah, they did the commercial break like it was this huge threat. Like, oh no, if another person gets put in the penalty box, then Tasha goes into nothingness. Oh, so the only person who can save your dear Tasha now, who could kill your dear Tasha now, is you. Dun dun dun. And then 2 minutes later, penalty over. What's the fucking point? So the whole first half of this episode with the games or whatever, it was all like talk. Like, it was like, oh, let's do these games. Let's have these games. Let's do these games. And then nothing really happens out of it. They just talk about playing games, and they don't play it. You know what? I was thinking of Lower Decks, how they did this parody of Q. It was like in a flashback or something, so they didn't have a whole episode, but they had the bridge crew of the Cerritos like being chess pieces. That Q was forcing them to do like a game of chess. Like, that would be cool. But anyway, this is just bullshit. It's just an army coming to kill them. That's war. That's not games. It's not even war games. But anyway, and then, yeah, the whole point was the give Riker the power of the Q. This whole storyline with Riker being tempted, I think, fails miserably. Like, it doesn't make any sense, because at first, like Riker is laughing when he learns that Q gave him his powers, and Q's like, "Oh, you share the joke," and Riker's like, "You're the joke," and laughing at him, saying it's absolutely ridiculous, and how he absolutely would not be tempted to use the powers. And then he made a promise with Picard to not use the powers, and then they beam down to the planet and they find this girl who just died, and Data's like, "Oh, you could save her," and Crusher's like, "Surely you couldn't," and he's like, "No, I can't, because I made a promise to a friend," and it obviously really pissed him off. And then he goes to the bridge, and he's acting all arrogant and being, "Oh, Jean-Luc, and they even quote the phrase, the famous line, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely," which is actually something I really believe in, although I am also couple that phrase with the other phrase, "Power is money, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So those with a lot of money become corrupt. But that's not the point of this episode. And they make it too obvious. Like, Riker's really all of a sudden and very jarringly starts acting out of character and starts acting all arrogant and like, "Oh, Jean-Luc." And then when they call the bridge crew to the bridge, they're all like apprehensive towards Riker. Like, Riker's like, "Oh, I'm the same guy I ever was," and everyone's sitting there like, "Yeah, sure, whatever, I don't believe you." And that's also inconsistent, because in the scene with the little girl, Data and Crusher wanted him to use his powers to save the girl's life. I think that scene was very, like, if we go from scene to scene to scene, from Riker rejecting Q and laughing at him, to everyone wanting Riker to save this little girl's life, to everyone rejecting Riker and thinking he's an arrogant prick and he's starting to act like an arrogant prick, these things do not connect. They do not flow. They're inconsistent with each other. And they're jarring. Like, they're just out of character. Riker's out of character. Crusher's out of character, Data's out of character, Geordi's out of character. They want it. Why didn't he save that little girl's life? Like, I think he should have. And I think that's a moral conundrum which they completely throw in the trash and reject and completely forget about and turn into, "Oh, now he's being an arrogant prick who wants to show off his powers." What does that, like, that is not a good payoff to this moral conundrum that they presented. And then the whole powers thing of, I understand why Wesley wouldn't want to be, old. He would want to grow up naturally. But I don't know if I buy Data's, like, resisting not to be human. It's like, don't make me human. He said, "I would not want to compound one illusion with another." He's like, "Your powers may seem real to you, they may seem real to Q, but they're not real to me." Why not? Like, Q actually, like, his powers are real. Like, when he changes something, it's not an illusion, it's actually really happening. That's been established very clearly, even by this point in Encounter at Farpoint and this episode. So, what you say here makes no sense. I was going to quote that Happy Gilmore thing. Everyone is dumber for having listened to it, but it's not quite that bad. But it's just nonsensical. This whole thing is nonsensical. The whole thing is very bad writing. Like, there's nuggets of things that make sense. And then you have, like Riker being humiliated, and it's like, "Oh, you're right. I feel like an idiot," and Picard's like, "So you should." And then he just moves on and forgets about it. Like, this episode is so out of character for Riker. Like, not just that last scene. That last scene is inconsistent with the earlier parts of the episode, but the entire episode, like, this just doesn't feel like Riker at all. I don't know. And as I said, like, they've done Q better. So, Now, let me go ahead and read some comments from my Patreon supporters. But first, I want to thank all of those who support me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It helps the channel thrive, and that is very much appreciated. So we have Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miguelesio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howes. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we have a couple comments for this episode. First comment is from Ricky, who says, yeah, Q still sucks here. I mean, he repeatedly says games all the time. I mean, this episode is so silly and ridiculous, although I will say this is a slightly better episode than the pilot episode, for I had more fun with it. Also, the whole Riker thing, having powers and acting like a god, was very unoriginal. I do believe that Q found his footing not on the next appearance, but in Deja Q. That's when the character became so rich and dynamic. Yeah, I find Q Who not the first great Q episode, but yeah, nothing much more to say about this. My rating is a 3 out of 10. Yep, absolutely agree 100%. Deja Q was the first good Q episode. Next comment is from Matty Jester, who says, I like Q, but this isn't one of my favorite Q episodes. I don't agree that it's acceptable for Riker to save Wesley and Worf from horrible bayonet stabbings, but it isn't acceptable to save the little girl from being crushed to death by debris. The episode says it's because Q created the fictional alien soldiers, so saving Wesley and Worf from them is okay, but if the end result is death, what does it matter how the injury happened in the first place? Either Riker should save Wesley, Worf, and the little girl, or leave them all to die. Personally, I would have saved the little girl, then erased the memory of Geordi and the others. As far as they are concerned, she was merely injured under the rubble, not dead. If that's too dishonest, well, to quote Captain Sisko, I can live with it. 4 out of 10 from me. I agree. I think that it is kind of inconsistent to be like, because Picard's the one who pointed out, oh, well, Q was the one who put Wesley and Worf in danger in the first place. So, I don't think Riker would have to erase Geordi's memory, because I think Geordi, Data, and Crusher wanted him to do it. That's what they're acting like in the scene. In the next scene, they act like all snub up and whatever, but that's, as I said, inconsistent. So yeah, I mean, I guess the point is he shouldn't use his powers at all. But here's the thing, when he goes in the next scene to give them all gifts, why doesn't Crusher or someone point out, hey, why don't you bring that girl back to life instead of making my son a grown man? I don't know. It's just so sloppily written. Anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neal Howes, who says, Hyde and Q. I'm on the fence about Q. A lot of the time I find him tiresome. If he's so superior, why does he resort to so much infantile humor? Q in this episode is only slightly less annoying than the practical Joker in that episode of Star Trek The Animated Series. Riker gets Q powers and saves Worf and Wesley from being bayoneted, but because of a stupid promise made to the insufferable self-righteous Picard, he can't save the girl. And then he proceeds to give his friend gifts without bothering to ask if they even want them. If I had been put in a situation, I would have told Riker to take his gifts and shove them up his arse. And we can all watch in disbelief as Worf throws a Klingon woman across the room. Jesus, Worf, just give you a potential lover a copy of Spinal Tap's Smell the Glove album. That would be arguably less offensive. And there's a very uncomfortable scene where Tasha Yar makes a Dumsy pass at a Picard. Dumsy pass at Picard. I didn't even notice that. Anyway, Riker, stripped of his Q powers, tells Picard, I feel like such an idiot. Picard replies, quite right, so you should. I loathe the moral smugness of early TNG. 2 penalty boxes out of 10. Oh yeah, that whole scene with Worf in that female Klingon, and someone, I think it was Geordi, asked, is this your idea of sex? And Worf says, this is sex. And then my next question would be, shouldn't you go someplace private? Like, are you going to just do it on the bridge in front of everyone else? I don't know. That's where my mind went. But anyway, yeah, and the whole thing that Worf rejects it, it says, I have no place in my life or whatever. She is from a world now alien to me, is what he said. Again, this is before they really established what Worf's... Because even up to now, this point, even in this episode, Worf's like, I'm a Klingon, Klingon. So I don't know, I don't buy that a world now alien to me bullshit. It doesn't quite fit. But anyway, my rating for Hyde and Q out of 10, I've been going back and forth of whether or not I should give this a 3 or 4. Part of me thinking, no, it's not quite bad as a 3, and the other part thinks it's a little bit worse than a 4. So, I'm going to give it a 3. Hell, you guys convinced me. Patreon comments convinced me. I'll get it down to a 3. Very poor. Yeah, because the whole thing is a mess. The writing's inconsistent. The characters are out of character. Q talks about games, but they just don't actually do any games, and it's kind of boring. Even though there's a few moments I like, such as, Q mocking Picard going, seize my vessel, seize my vessel. And some of the interactions between Q and Riker are actually good. But, yeah, for the most part, this is like... all the characters are out of the characters. Each scene is inconsistent with. It's just sloppy writing, plain and simple. So that is it for my review of Hyde and Q. So let me just bring up the schedule of what's coming up next. So next Monday will be my review for Haven. Thursday I'll be covering the latest episode of Strange New Worlds. And then Saturday, back for another TNG review with the big goodbye. Not the small one, but the big one. So be sure to check out my channel for that, as well as I cover many other Star Trek videos and many other videos and many other shows. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.